I sold them. We needed the money for the trip. And honestly, Raymond, they were just sitting there, collecting dust. Those were the exact words my daughter-in-law said to me on a Tuesday morning in March, standing in my own kitchen, holding a coffee mug I had bought, wearing slippers she had left scattered across my hallway floor for the past 8 months. She said it the way someone might mention they had taken out the trash casual, unbothered, certain that the world owed her an explanation for nothing. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. I looked past her toward the living room, toward the corner where the old oak console table had always stood, where Carol's record player had sat for 31 years next to a milk crate of vinyl albums, their spines worn soft from being touched so many times. The table was still there. The milk crate was still there. But the records were gone, and the turntable was gone, and something inside me went very quiet in the way that only happens when something irreplaceable leaves the world. I want to tell you about Carol before I tell you anything else, because nothing that happened after that morning makes sense without her. We met in the fall of 1988 at a community center dance in Columbus, Ohio. I was 26 and too nervous to ask anyone to dance. She walked across the floor and asked me instead. That was Carol. She never waited for the world to come to her. She taught 3rd grade for 22 years. She made the best apple butter anyone in our neighborhood had ever tasted. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which meant you were always laughing before you understood why. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel more inhabited just by being in it. She also loved music the way most people love breathing. Not casually, not as background noise, but deeply and specifically. She had started collecting vinyl records when she was 16 years old, buying them at garage sales and thrift stores and the occasional record shop downtown whenever we had a little extra. By the time we had been married a decade, she had built a collection of nearly 200 albums. Jazz, mostly Coltrane, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, but also folk, and some old country, and a handful of records she kept in paper sleeves at the very bottom of the crate that she called her private treasures. She got sick in the spring of 2021, pancreatic cancer. She was gone by October. I won't dwell on those months because even now they feel like a country I visited once and cannot return to and cannot fully describe to anyone who hasn't been there. What I will say is that after the funeral, after everyone had gone home and the casseroles had been eaten and the sympathy cards had stopped coming, I found myself sitting in the living room at 2 a.m, putting on one of her records just to have something of hers still moving in the room. The needle would drop, the static would come, and then the music. And for a few minutes, I didn't feel entirely alone. I kept everything exactly as she had left it. The records in the crate, the turntable on the console table, the worn-down stylus she had been meaning to replace. All of it. My son called me in June of the following year. He said he and his wife were going through a rough patch financially. His hours had been cut at the distribution warehouse where he worked. His wife, she went by Stephanie, though Carol had always called her Stevie, and Stephanie had always corrected her with a particular tightness around the mouth, had left her job at the dental office after what she described as a conflict with management. They had 2 kids, my grandchildren, a 10-year-old named Noah and an 8-year-old named Grace. They were about to lose their apartment. I said yes before he finished asking. Of course I did. They were my family. The house had 3 bedrooms, and I was using one. Carol would have said the same thing. They moved in on a Saturday with a rented truck and more boxes than I expected. Within a week, Stephanie had rearranged the kitchen to a configuration I didn't understand and never quite adapted to. Within a month, Noah and Grace had claimed the backyard as their permanent territory, which I didn't mind at all because I liked hearing them out there. Within 2 months, I noticed that my son had not mentioned anything about looking for a new apartment. I didn't push it. I told myself they needed time to stabilize. I covered the utilities. I bought the groceries most weeks. When Stephanie mentioned that Grace needed new shoes for school, I drove her to the store. When my son said his truck needed a repair, I wrote the check. I told myself, this is what fathers do. This is what Carol would have wanted. But there were things I noticed that I kept folding up and putting away in some back drawer of my mind because I didn't want to look at them directly. I noticed that Stephanie often had new things, a jacket, a pair of earrings, a coffee maker she ordered online that appeared without any conversation about where the money had come from. I noticed that my son had started talking about a trip to Nashville, how Stephanie had always wanted to go, how it would be good for them as a couple. I noticed that when I asked about job applications, the conversation changed direction the way a river changes direction around a rock smoothly, automatically, without acknowledgement that it had changed at all. I also noticed, starting sometime in January, that Stephanie had developed a habit of standing in the living room looking at Carol's record collection with an expression I can only describe as appraising. I should have said something then. I know that now. On the Monday before she told me, I came downstairs early for coffee and found the living room lighter than it should have been. It took me a moment to understand why. The crate was still there. The console table was still there. But the records were gone. The turntable was gone. I stood in the doorway and felt the absence of those things like a change in air pressure. I went through the house. I checked the garage. I checked the closets. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, that my son had moved them for some reason, that they would reappear. I waited until Stephanie came downstairs. I asked her where Carol's records were. She told me she had sold them. She said it the way I already told you casually, holding her coffee mug in my kitchen, wearing my hospitality like a coat she had borrowed so long ago she had forgotten it wasn't hers. She said they had found a vintage shop on 4th Street that bought the whole collection. She said the turntable alone had gotten them enough to cover the Nashville hotel. She said she hadn't thought I would mind because it had been over a year, and I never really played them anymore. I remember that the refrigerator was humming. I remember the particular quality of the morning light through the window above the sink. I remember that I set down my coffee cup very carefully on the counter because I did not trust my hands. I said, "Those belong to my wife." She said, "I know, Raymond. But she's been gone for a while now, and you have to start moving forward. There are moments in a person's life that function like a door swinging open. You walk through, and you cannot walk back. And everything on the other side is different from what you thought it would be." That was one of those moments for me. Not because of the grief, though the grief was there. But because in that sentence, "she's been gone for a while now," I understood something about the 8 months that had passed, and about the months that were coming, and about how far I had allowed the boundaries of my own life to erode without noticing. I didn't raise my voice. I told her that I was going to the record shop that afternoon, and that I expected her and my son to be available to talk when I came home. Then I picked up my coffee cup, went upstairs, got dressed, and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the photograph of Carol and me on the nightstand from our trip to the Smoky Mountains in 2014. She was laughing in it, mid-sentence, her eyes crinkled at the corners. She looked like herself. I drove to the vintage shop on 4th Street at noon. It was the kind of place that smelled like old paper and wood polish, with records lined up in bins and a handwritten sign in the window about fair prices for collections. A young man with a beard and a flannel shirt came out from the back when the bell above the door rang. I told him my daughter-in-law had sold him a collection of vinyl records the previous day, approximately 200 albums, a milk crate, and a Thorin's turntable with a worn stylus. I told him they had belonged to my late wife and had been sold without my knowledge or consent. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You're Raymond Calloway." I told him I was. He said he had been hoping I would come in. He walked to the back of the store and returned with a flat manila envelope. He set it on the glass counter between us and said that when he had been going through the collection the previous evening, cataloging the albums before pricing them, he had found something inside the sleeve of one of the records that he was sure hadn't been meant to be sold. He said he had looked at the name written on the inside of the crate and done some searching online, and he had found my phone number but hadn't been sure whether to call. I opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a folded piece of notepaper. The photograph was taken at our wedding reception June 12th, 1990. Carol and I were on the dance floor. It was the song, the one we had chosen together, Nat King Cole's Unforgettable, which she had loved since she was a girl. We were both laughing in it, foreheads almost touching. I hadn't seen this photograph before. I didn't know it existed. I turned it over, on the back, in Carol's handwriting. The best moment of my whole life. I unfolded the notepaper. It wasn't long. 4 sentences and a closing line. Ray, if you're reading this, something happened, and I didn't get to tell you in person. I hid this here because I knew you would always keep the records close and never let them go. I need you to know that everything you are afraid of, you are stronger than. You always have been. I love you without end. C. I stood at that counter for a while without speaking. The young man behind it had the good sense not to say anything. I don't know exactly when she had written it or how long it had been in that sleeve. I think she must have placed it there sometime during those final months, when she knew what was coming and was doing the quiet, private work of tying up the loose ends she didn't want to leave for me. Carol was always thinking ahead. She was always, in her way, taking care of me before I knew I needed it. I put the photograph and the note back in the envelope. I asked the young man how much he had paid for the collection. He told me. I offered him the same amount, plus a fair markup for his trouble. We agreed on a number. He said he would have everything boxed and ready for me by the end of the week, and that the turntable was already on a shelf in the back, and I could take it that day. I drove home with the turntable in the back seat and Carol's letter in my shirt pocket, against my chest. My son was home by the time I got back. He and Stephanie were in the living room. He had the look on his face that I remembered from when he was a teenager and had done something he knew was wrong and was constructing his defense in real time. He started talking before I sat down about the financial pressure, about how Stephanie had thought the records were just taking up space, about how they had meant to say something but the timing was never right, about how they were going to pay me back. I let him finish. Then I said I needed to ask them some questions, and I needed honest answers. I asked whether they had been contributing anything toward rent or utilities in the 8 months they had been living in my house. My son said they had been going through a hard time. I said that wasn't what I had asked. I asked whether Stephanie's new jacket and the new coffee maker and the weekend in Nashville had been purchased with money they had said they didn't have. Stephanie said I was being unfair. I said I was being specific. Then I told them I had found some things I wanted them to explain. I had found, in the weeks before the records disappeared, a credit card statement forwarded to my address for a card I didn't recognize, in my son's name, with my home address listed as the billing address. I had found 2 notices from a collections agency that had been placed face down at the bottom of the mail pile on the entry table, which I had assumed were junk mail until I actually read them. And I had noticed, while cleaning the bathroom the previous week, that the water damage beneath the sink cabinet that I had mentioned to my son in November had gotten significantly worse and had spread to the subfloor, which meant the repair that might have cost $300 in November was now likely to cost considerably more. My son's expression had changed during this recitation from defensive to something more complicated. Stephanie's had not changed much at all. She said, "Raymond, we're family. You're making this into something it isn't." I said, "I'm going to be very clear with you about what this is." I told them that I had spent the previous day not only at the record shop but also on the phone with a real estate attorney named Patricia Huang, whose office was on Broad Street and who specialized in property and tenancy law. I told them that because they had been living in my home for more than 30 days and had been given a key, they had established tenancy rights under Ohio law, regardless of whether we had signed a formal lease. I told them that this meant I could not simply ask them to leave and have it be over. I told them that I had, on Attorney Huang's advice, already drafted a formal notice to quit 30 days, which was the minimum required, and that I would be hand-delivering it to them that evening after dinner, and that I had sent a copy to Attorney Huang's office by email that afternoon. The room was quiet for a moment. My son said, "Dad." I said, "Let me finish." I told them that Attorney Huang had also advised me to document the condition of the house now, including the water damage and any other damage that had occurred during their stay, and that I had already walked through the house that morning with my phone and photographed everything. I told them that the cost of those repairs would be deducted from the security deposit, and that if there was no security deposit, which there wasn't, because I had never thought to ask for one, then I would be filing in small claims court for the difference. Stephanie said, "You'd really take your own son to court?" I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at my son. I said, "I'd really like not to. But I've had 8 months to understand what kind of situation I'm in, and I think I've been slower to understand it than I should have been. That ends now. My son said he was sorry. He said it quietly, looking at the floor, and I believed him in the way you can believe someone is sorry and still know that the sorry doesn't undo the thing they did. He was my son. I had held him in a hospital room when he was 4 hours old. I had gone to every single baseball game he had ever played in, including the ones where he struck out 3 times and came home from the car ride in silence. I loved him. I did not stop loving him, but love is not the same as permission. The 30 days were difficult. There were mornings when Stephanie didn't speak to me at all, and evenings when my son would come into the kitchen and start a conversation that would veer toward negotiation, and I would have to redirect it every time. There were 2 occasions when Stephanie raised her voice, and once when she cried, and I understood that these were real emotions, even if I also understood that they were being used instrumentally. There was one weekend when I overheard her on the phone telling someone, her mother, I think, that I was being vindictive and cruel, and I went outside and sat on the back porch for a long time, listening to the birds until I felt like myself again. My grandchildren were the hardest part. Noah and Grace hadn't done anything wrong, and watching them carry boxes to the rented truck on moving day, looking confused and a little frightened, was the thing that came closest to breaking me. I hugged them both at the door. I told them that Grandpa's house was still their house whenever they wanted to visit, that the backyard was still theirs, that nothing had changed between us. Grace held on for longer than I expected. Noah said, very formally for a 10-year-old, "I know this wasn't your fault, Grandpa." I had to look away for a moment after he said that. My son and Stephanie moved to an apartment complex in Westerville, about 20 minutes away. We didn't speak for about 6 weeks after the move. Then one Sunday he called and asked if he could come over. He sat at the kitchen table in its original configuration now, put back the way Carol had always arranged it, and we talked for about 2 hours. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one, maybe the most honest one we had ever had, and at the end of it, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I had been holding. I did not forgive Stephanie easily or quickly, and I won't pretend I did. What she had done with those records wasn't carelessness. It was a particular kind of contempt dressed up as practicality, the belief that my grief was an inconvenience she was entitled to set aside for her own convenience. I have thought about those words "she's been gone for a while now," more times than I can count. I have thought about what kind of person says something like that, and what kind of conditions produce that person, and whether my son had seen it happening over the years and looked away, and whether I had seen it too and done the same. I don't have clean answers to those questions. I don't think clean answers exist. What I do know is that I chose, after a lot of time and a lot of quiet mornings, with a cup of coffee and Carol's letter on the table in front of me, to extend the possibility of forgiveness without requiring myself to feel it before it was ready. That's the best I could do. The house sold in August. I had listed it with a real estate agent in April, a 3-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood I had lived in for 28 years. The same neighborhood where Carol and I had brought a newborn son home from the hospital, where we had planted a garden every spring that produced more tomatoes than we could ever use, where she had died in the bedroom upstairs on a cool October evening with her hand in mine. Selling it was one of the harder decisions I have made, and also one of the clearer ones. 3 bedrooms for one person is not a home. It is a museum, and museums are places you visit, not places you live. I found a cottage in a smaller community about 40 minutes outside the city. 1 bedroom, a sunroom, a half-acre of yard that had been somewhat neglected by the previous owners, but had good bones. My neighbor across the street, a retired pharmacist named Gerald, brought over a 6-pack of beer on the day I moved in and told me the neighborhood association met on the first Thursday of every month, and that attendance was optional, but the coffee was good. I told him I would think about it. I went twice that first winter and found I enjoyed it more than I expected. I put Carol's record collection in the sunroom, where the morning light comes in at an angle that seems designed specifically for putting on an album and sitting with a cup of coffee and doing nothing in particular. The turntable sits on a low table I built myself from a kit. I had never been especially handy, but I found that the work of fitting pieces together and sanding and finishing them gave my hands something to do that my mind could follow. And I had started a second project before the first one was finished. The sunroom smelled like wood shavings for a while, which I liked. The photograph from the wedding reception sits in a frame on the mantel in the living room. Carol laughing, both of us mid-song, the moment she had called the best of her whole life. I look at it most mornings when I come down the stairs. Sometimes I talk to it, which I understand is something people do when they have loved someone a very long time, and the habit of speaking to them does not simply stop because they are gone. The letter I keep folded in the drawer of my nightstand, next to my reading glasses and the worn paperback mystery novel I have been working through for 3 months. I read it sometimes when I can't sleep. 4 sentences and a closing line. Everything you are afraid of, you are stronger than. She knew me better than I knew myself. She always had. I think about what would have happened if my daughter-in-law hadn't sold those records. I think about whether Carol's letter would have stayed in that sleeve for another 5 years, or 10, slowly yellowing, while I went on believing there was nothing in it but the album I had played at our wedding. I think about how a terrible thing can sometimes contain the mechanism of something necessary, the way a forest fire kills the old growth and releases the seeds that have been waiting for heat to open. I am not suggesting that what Stephanie did was right. It wasn't. I am saying that the world sometimes uses bad events as delivery systems for things you needed to receive. I am 64 years old. My knees bother me in the mornings, and I take a medication for my cholesterol that I sometimes forget, and then have to go back to the kitchen for after I am already down the driveway. My son comes to visit on the occasional Sunday, and we watch football together and order pizza and talk about Noah's baseball team and Grace's new interest in drawing, and we are rebuilding something between us that is different from what we had before, but not less valuable for being different. He and Stephanie are still married. She and I are cordial when I see her, which is not often. I have made my peace with that. Gerald and I have gotten into the habit of a morning walk on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He is funny in a dry, unhurried way that I appreciate. He is also recently widowed, his wife having passed the previous spring, and we have the particular ease with each other that comes from having lost the same kind of thing and not needing to explain it. We don't talk about our wives constantly. We talk about the weather and local politics and whether the coffee shop on Elm Street that recently changed ownership has gotten better or worse. But sometimes, on a quieter stretch of the path, one of us will say something about them, a small memory, a habit, something they used to say, and the other one will nod, and we will keep walking. Last month, I taught myself to make apple butter from a recipe I found tucked inside one of Carol's old cookbooks, written in her handwriting on a folded index card. I burned the first batch. The second batch came out well enough that I brought a jar to Gerald, and he said it was the best he'd ever had. I think he was being generous, but I told him I'd bring another jar when I made the next batch, and I meant it. I am not going to tell you that grief ends, or that betrayal stops hurting, or that the people we love most do not sometimes disappoint us in ways we did not anticipate. All of those things are true, and I think you already know them. What I want to tell you, the thing that still feels like something worth saying, is that in the middle of the worst 8 months of my adult life, a record shop owner on 4th Street held on to a manila envelope he could have discarded. And inside it was a 4-sentence letter from a woman who had been gone for 2 years and had still, in her meticulous and forward-thinking way, found a path through the darkness to put her hand on my shoulder. I put on the Nat King Cole record the other night. I don't do it often because it is not a casual record for me. It is a particular one, the kind you put on when you are ready to be present with something tender. I sat in the sunroom in the dark with the windows open and the spring air coming in, and I listened to the whole side, and when it ended, I sat for a while longer in the sound of the needle going around in the silence of the final groove, that soft rhythmic scratch that sounds, if you're in the right frame of mind, a little like breathing. Then I got up, lifted the needle, and put the record carefully back in its sleeve. I made sure the envelope was still inside. I slid it back into the crate. She told me I was stronger than everything I was afraid of. I am still finding out whether that is true. So far, on most days, it seems to be.